Welcome to our Wild West story. Please subscribe and state your state in the comment. Let's dive in. The dust of the town square in Havenwood swirled in the oppressive August heat, a gritty golden curtain that did little to soften the grim reality of the scene. It was choosing day, a day that struck a chord of cold, metallic dread in the hearts of the children from the Blackwood orphanage. Lined up on a makeshift wooden stage, they stood like so many sacks of flour waiting for inspection, their small shoulders slumped, their eyes downcast, fixed on the splintered planks beneath their worn-out shoes. The townsfolk, a motley collection of the curious, the callous, and the quietly compassionate, milled about below. Their gazes were sharp and appraising, weighing the worth of a child in calloused hands and the potential for a season's hard labor. Among the children stood Elara, a girl of 8 whose existence felt as fragile as a dandelion seed in the wind. Her hair, the color of spun moonlight, was a stark contrast to the grime of the orphanage, and her eyes, as gray as a stormy sea, held a depth of sorrow that no child should ever know. She had been at Blackwood Orphanage for as long as she could remember, her memories of a life before a hazy, dreamlike collage of a woman's soft lullaby, the scent of wildflowers and lavender, and the comforting weight of a hand stroking her hair. Now her world was the splintered floorboards, the constant gnawing chill of the stone building, the watery gruel that barely filled her belly, and the hollow ache of a loneliness that was her most constant companion. The auctioneer, a portly man named Mr. Grimsby with a booming voice and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes, began his spiel. He was a master of his grim trade, painting pictures with words that bore no resemblance to the frightened children behind him. "Sturdy lads and lasses," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the square. "Obedient, hard-working, and eager to please. A fine investment for any discerning citizen of Havenwood." Elara watched, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides, as one by one, her fellow orphans were prodded and examined. A boy named Thomas, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes bright with a defiant spark, was poked in the ribs by a burly blacksmith. "Good for hauling coal and working the bellows," Mr. Grimsby declared. Thomas was sold for a pittance, his shoulders finally slumping in defeat as he was led away. Next came Lily, a tiny girl with wide, terrified eyes who was inspected by a stern-faced woman who ran the local laundry. The woman felt Lily's thin arms and nodded curtly. "She'll do for scrubbing and wringing," she said, her voice as starched as the collars she laundered. Lily cast a desperate, pleading look back at Elara before she was pulled from the stage, her small sobs lost in the noise of the crowd. Elara's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. She had seen the way the chosen children were treated, their spirits slowly eroded by endless work and loveless homes until they were little more than empty, silent shells. She had heard their muffled sobs in the dead of night, their whispered prayers for an escape that never came. She would rather face the vast, terrifying unknown than the bleak certainty of a life of servitude. In her pocket, her fingers closed around a small, smooth riverstone, its surface worn silky by years of anxious rubbing. It was the only thing she had left of her mother, a tangible link to a love she could barely recall. As the day wore on, the sun beat down mercilessly, and the crowd began to thin. Only a few children remained on the stage, their hopes dwindling with the setting sun. Elara was one of them. She had been deemed too small, too frail, her quiet, watchful nature mistaken for defiance or dullness. A sense of despair, cold and heavy as a wet blanket, settled over her. Perhaps this was her fate, to be returned to the orphanage, to endure another year of the cruel matron Gable's sharp tongue and sharper cane, another year of gnawing hunger and suffocating loneliness. Then a shadow fell over the square, so sudden and vast it seemed to swallow the afternoon light. A man on a magnificent black stallion rode into town, his presence so commanding that it silenced the remaining chatter. He was a mountain of a man, his shoulders broad enough to block the sun, his face a road map of weathered lines, and a thick, grizzled beard the color of salt and pepper. His eyes, the startling blue of chips of ice, swept over the remaining children, and a collective, involuntary shudder went through them. It was Silas Blackwood, the rancher from the high country. His name was a legend in Havenwood, whispered in hushed, fearful tones. He was a recluse, a hermit who lived in self-imposed exile on his sprawling, untamed ranch, a place rumored to be as wild and unforgiving as the man himself. They said he was a monster, a man with a heart as cold and hard as the granite peaks that surrounded his land. They said he had a temper that could rival a thunderstorm and a past shrouded in a darkness that no one dared to probe. He never came to town, not for supplies, not for anything. His appearance now was as shocking as a blizzard in July. Silas dismounted, his heavy boots kicking up clouds of dust. He strode toward the stage, his every step radiating an aura of raw power and intimidation. Mr. Grimsby, who had been on the verge of packing up, straightened up, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and avarice. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice a fawning purr that was a stark contrast to his usual boom. "A latecomer to the proceedings. An unexpected pleasure. Are you in the market for a new hand?" Silas didn't answer. His piercing gaze was fixed on the children, his expression as unreadable as the stone faces on the mountains he called home. He walked the length of the stage, his eyes lingering on each child for a moment before moving on. The children flinched under his scrutiny, their small bodies trembling like leaves in a storm. He stopped in front of Elara. She had to crane her neck to look up at him, her heart lodged in her throat. His eyes, which had seemed so cold and cruel from a distance, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher up close. It wasn't pity, nor was it kindness. It was a deep, profound sadness, a sorrow so vast it seemed to echo the emptiness in her own soul. It was a look she recognized, a look she had seen in her own reflection in a puddle after a rainstorm. In that moment, a strange, inexplicable impulse took hold of her. It was a desperate gamble, a wild shot in the dark, but it was all she had left. As Silas reached out a large, calloused hand, not to touch her, but to point, to choose her like a piece of livestock, she did the unthinkable. She stepped forward, her small, trembling legs carrying her across the stage until she was standing right in front of him, the toes of her worn shoes nearly touching his dusty boots. And then, before anyone could react, before the gasps had even formed in the throats of the onlookers, she threw her arms around his waist, burying her face in the rough, clean-smelling fabric of his coat. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest, the word a desperate prayer. "You came for me." A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd. Mr. Grimsby's jaw dropped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Silas Blackwood, the feared, the monstrous, the man who was said to have a heart of stone, stood frozen, his body rigid with shock. For a long, stretched-out moment, there was only silence. Elara could feel the thunderous, steady beating of his heart against her ear, a powerful rhythm that was strangely comforting, like the drumbeat of the earth itself. She clung to him, her small hands fisted in his coat, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and a desperate, burgeoning hope. She expected to be thrown off, to be yelled at, to feel the sting of a blow. But none of that happened. Instead, slowly, tentatively, a large calloused hand came to rest on her head. It was a hesitant, almost clumsy touch, as if he were afraid she might shatter like glass. He didn't push her away. He didn't yell or curse. He simply stood there, his hand a warm, heavy weight on her moonbeam hair. "The girl," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her entire body. "I'll take the girl." The journey to Silas's ranch was a blur of new and overwhelming sensations. Elara sat in front of him on the wide leather saddle, her small body nestled against his broad chest. The rhythmic sway of the horse, a powerful creature named Shadow, the creak of the saddle leather, the clean, earthy scent of pine and horse that clung to Silas's clothes. It was all a stark, beautiful contrast to the stagnant air and the smell of bleach and decay that had permeated the orphanage. They rode in a profound silence, the only sound the steady clip-clop of Shadow's hooves on the winding mountain trail. Elara, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day, drifted in and out of a light, restless sleep. Each time she jolted awake, a fresh wave of panic washing over her, she would find herself still safely ensconced in Silas's arms, his presence a solid, reassuring wall against the world. He never spoke, But once, when a cool breeze swept down from the peaks, he wordlessly adjusted his thick coat to shield her better from the chill. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew crisp and cool, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. The landscape transformed from the dusty, sun-baked plains of the town to a lush, verdant wilderness. Towering pine and aspen trees reached for the sky, their branches forming a lacy canopy that dappled the trail in a soft, green-gold light. Wildflowers in a riot of purples, yellows, and reds bloomed in the high country meadows, their sweet fragrance a balm to Elara's weary soul. She saw a deer and its fawn watching them from the edge of the woods, their liquid brown eyes wide with curiosity, and for the first time in a very long time, a genuine smile touched her lips. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink, and casting long, dramatic shadows across the land, they arrived at the ranch. It was a sprawling, rustic homestead, nestled in a valley surrounded by majestic, snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the heavens. A large, sturdy log cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light, stood at the center of a collection of barns and outbuildings. A herd of horses grazed peacefully in a nearby pasture, their coats shimmering like polished stones in the golden light of the setting sun. It was a place of breathtaking, rugged beauty, a place that seemed untouched by the ugliness of the world Elara had known. It was a place of profound peace, of solitude, a place that seemed to be a perfect reflection of the quiet, formidable man who called it home. Silas dismounted with a practiced, fluid motion that belied his size. He lifted Elara from the saddle, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he set her on her feet. Her legs, weak and unsteady after the long ride, buckled beneath her. He steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but not unkind. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch," he said, his voice a low grumble that was carried away by the evening breeze. Just then the cabin door opened, and a man emerged, wiping his hands on an apron. He was older than Silas, his hair a shock of unruly white, his face lined with kindness, and his eyes a warm, kindly blue. "Silas," he said, his voice filled with a gentle, chiding affection. "You're late. I was starting to worry. The stew's been ready for an hour." His gaze fell on Elara, who was hiding shyly behind Silas's leg, and his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "And who is this little one? Don't tell me you finally brought home one of those stray pups you're always feeding." "This is Elara," Silas said, his voice gruff, though Elara thought she detected a note of something else in it, something almost offensive. "She'll be staying with us." The man's eyes softened as he looked at Elara. He knelt down, wincing slightly at the creak of his knees so that he was at her level. He offered her a warm, genuine smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "Well, hello there, Elara," he said, his voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "My name is Jedediah, but everyone just calls me Jed. It's a true pleasure to meet you." Elara, who had been taught to fear strangers, found herself drawn to the undeniable kindness in his eyes. She offered him a small, hesitant smile in return and took a half step out from behind Silas's leg. "Come on inside, both of you," Jed said, his eyes twinkling. "Supper's on the table, and I've made my famous beef and barley stew. It's guaranteed to warm you up from the inside out and put some meat on those little bones." The inside of the cabin was as warm and inviting as it had appeared from the outside. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone fireplace, casting a warm, flickering glow over the comfortable, well-worn furniture. The air was filled with the delicious aroma of roasting meat, simmering vegetables, and baking bread. It was the smell of a home, a smell Elara had only ever dreamed of. Elara sat at the large, polished wooden table, her small hands clasped nervously in her lap. Jed placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of her, its rich, savory scent making her stomach rumble audibly. She blushed, but Jed just chuckled. "That's the sound I like to hear," he said. She hadn't had a proper meal in as long as she could remember. The watery gruel at the orphanage had been barely enough to sustain her, a constant reminder of her own emptiness. She picked up her spoon, her hand trembling slightly. She took a tentative bite, and her eyes widened in surprise. The stew was a symphony of flavors, the meat so tender it melted in her mouth, the vegetables perfectly cooked, the broth rich and hearty. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate with a quiet, desperate hunger, her eyes fixed on her bowl, barely daring to breathe between spoonfuls. She was so engrossed in her meal that she didn't notice the two men watching her, their expressions a mixture of pity, sorrow, and a dawning understanding. Silas ate his own meal in silence, but his gaze kept drifting to the small girl who was devouring her food as if it were her last. When she had finished, scraping the last drop from the bowl, she looked up, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and deep satisfaction. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jed smiled at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're most welcome, little one. There's plenty more where that came from, and a slice of apple pie for after." After supper, which included a slice of the most wonderful apple pie Elara could have imagined, Jed showed her to her room. It was a small, cozy space under the eaves, with a sloping ceiling and a small window that looked out over the valley. A soft, patchwork quilt, stitched with patterns of stars and flowers, was spread over a small bed, and a vase of wildflowers sat on a small wooden nightstand. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. It was her room. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," Jed said, his voice gentle. "The quilt was made it was made a long time ago by someone very special. I think she would have wanted you to have it." Elara nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. She couldn't believe that this was happening, that she had been rescued from the horrors of the orphanage and brought to this beautiful, peaceful place. She ran a hand over the soft quilt, feeling the love that had been stitched into every seam. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jed smiled at her, his eyes filled with a gentle understanding. "You get some rest now, little one. You've had a long day, and don't you worry about a thing. You're safe here." He closed the door behind him, leaving Elara alone in her new room. She walked over to the window and looked out at the night sky. The stars were a brilliant, glittering canopy, their light undimmed by the smoke and grime of the town. They seemed close enough to touch. The moon, a perfect, silver orb, cast a soft, ethereal glow over the valley, turning the meadows to silver and the peaks to dark, sleeping giants. For the first time in a long, long time, Elara felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she could finally belong. The next morning, Elara woke not to the clanging of Matron Gable's bell, but to the gentle sound of birdsong. The sun was streaming through her window, its warm golden rays filling the room with a cheerful light. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar cozy surroundings a stark contrast to the drab gray walls and scratchy blankets of the orphanage. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back to her, and a small, tentative smile touched her lips. It wasn't a dream. She got out of bed and dressed in the simple, clean clothes, a soft cotton dress and sturdy leather shoes that had been laid out for her. They fit perfectly. She made her way downstairs, her bare feet padding softly on the cool, smooth wooden floor. The cabin was filled with the delicious aroma of frying bacon, freshly brewed coffee, and something sweet and cinnamony. She found Jed in the kitchen, humming a cheerful tune as he flipped pancakes on a large, cast-iron griddle. He smiled at her when he saw her, his eyes twinkling in the morning light. "Good morning, sunshine," he said, his voice warm and cheerful. "Did you sleep well?" Elara nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, thank you. The bed is very soft." "Good, good," he said, his smile widening. "A growing girl needs her rest. And her breakfast. You must be hungry." He placed a stack of fluffy pancakes on a plate, topped it with a pat of melting butter, and drizzled it with a generous amount of maple syrup. He set the plate in front of her at the big table, along with a glass of fresh, cold milk. Elara ate with gusto, her appetite a testament to the years of hunger she had endured. Jed watched her, a gentle, compassionate expression on his face. He didn't hover, but he made sure her plate was never empty for long. "Where's Grandpa?" Elara asked between bites, her voice a little hesitant as she tested the word in the light of a new day. Jed's smile faltered for just a moment, and a shadow passed over his kind eyes. "Silas is out with the horses," he said, his voice a little subdued. "He's an early riser. Always has been. The mountains call to him before the sun does." He hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward conspiratorially. He's a good man, Elara. A good, strong man. He's just been through a lot. His heart is like a house that's been boarded up for a long time. It'll take some time for the light to get back in. Elara didn't fully understand what he meant, but she nodded. She had seen the sadness in Silas's eyes, a sorrow that felt familiar, like an old worn coat. After breakfast, Elara ventured outside. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and dew. The sun was warm on her face. She wandered around the ranch, her eyes wide with wonder. She watched the horses in the pasture, their coats gleaming in the morning sun as they swished their long tails. She saw the chickens scratching in the dirt, their clucking a cheerful, domestic sound. She saw a herd of cows grazing peacefully in a nearby field, their bells a gentle, tinkling melody that drifted on the breeze. It was a world away from the filth and squalor of the town. It was a world of life, of beauty, of peace. She found Silas in the barn, mending a broken saddle. The barn was vast and smelled of hay and leather. Beams of dusty sunlight streamed through the high windows. He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice her at first. She stood in the doorway, watching him, her heart filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He was a man of immense strength. His hands, though calloused and rough, moved with a surprising dexterity and grace. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration, his entire being poured into the simple, honest task. He looked up then, as if sensing her presence, and his eyes met hers. He didn't smile, but the icy coldness that had been in his eyes the day before was gone. In its place was a flicker of something that looked almost like curiosity. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be swallowed by the barn's high rafters. "Just looking," Elara said, her voice a little shaky. "Jed said I could explore." He grunted in response and went back to his work. Elara hesitated for a moment, then took a tentative step into the barn. The air was warm and thick with the sweet smell of hay. She walked over to where he was working and stood beside him, watching him with a quiet fascination. She didn't say anything, and neither did he. They stood there in a comfortable, companionable silence. The only sound the rhythmic scrape of the needle as it moved through the thick leather and the soft cooing of pigeons in the rafters. After a while, Silas finished his work. He set the saddle aside and stood up, stretching his long, powerful limbs. He looked down at Elara, his expression unreadable. "Come on," he said, his voice gruff. "I'll show you something." He led her out of the barn and up a winding path that led to a small, secluded meadow she hadn't seen before. It was a quiet, peaceful place, sheltered by a grove of aspen trees. In the center of the meadow stood a magnificent old oak tree, its branches reaching for the sky like gnarled ancient arms. Under the tree were two small, simple graves, marked by weathered stones. Silas stood before the graves, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. Elara stood beside him, her heart filled with a sense of solemnity. The air here felt different, heavy with unspoken words. "This was my wife, Eleanor," Silas said, his voice so low that Elara could barely hear him over the rustling of the aspen leaves. "And this was our daughter, Rose." He pointed to a smaller grave next to the first one. "They died a long time ago," he said, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw, still palpable, even after all these years. "A fever took them in the dead of winter. The snow was too deep to get the doctor from town. There was nothing I could do." He fell silent, his broad shoulders slumped, his body racked with a silent, shuddering grief that he had clearly carried alone for too long. Elara looked up at his weathered profile, at the single tear that escaped his eye and traced a path through the dust on his cheek. Her own heart ached with a compassion that was far beyond her years. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his, a small, warm anchor in his vast sea of sorrow. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and a dawning, reluctant gratitude. She remembered the wildflowers she had seen on the trail. She let go of his hand, darted to the edge of the meadow, and picked a small, delicate bluebell. She came back and gently laid it on the smaller of the two graves. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a soft, gentle breeze. Rose is a beautiful name. He didn't say anything, but he squeezed her hand when she took it again, his grip surprisingly gentle. They stood there for a long time, the grieving man and the lonely girl, their shared, unspoken grief, a silent, invisible bond between them. In that moment, Elara understood. She understood the sadness in his eyes, the coldness in his demeanor, the formidable wall he had built around his heart. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had lost everything, a man who was drowning in a sea of grief and solitude. And in that moment, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she had been brought to this place for a reason. She had been brought here to heal and, in her own small way, to help him heal too. The days that followed settled into a quiet, comfortable rhythm. Elara, who had never known a real home, slowly began to settle into her new life, her roots finding purchase in the rich soil of Blackwood Ranch. She helped Jed in the kitchen, her small hands learning to knead dough, shell peas, and churn butter. She helped Silas in the barn, her nimble fingers learning to mend fences, groom horses, and gather eggs from the hens, who, to her delight, would often let her pet them. She was a quick learner, her mind a sponge that soaked up everything she was taught. She had a natural, gentle affinity for the animals. The horses, who were often skittish around strangers, would nuzzle her hand, and even the most aloof barn cat would wind itself around her ankles, purring. Silas, who had been so closed off, so distant, began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, open up to her. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was no longer a wall. It was a comfortable space they could share. He would tell her stories about his wife and daughter, his voice filled with a mixture of love and loss. He would teach her about the land, about the changing of the seasons, about the names of the stars and the delicate balance of life and death in the wilderness. He was still a gruff man, his exterior still weathered and tough. But there was a new softness in his eyes when he looked at her, a new gentleness in his touch when he helped her onto a horse or showed her how to hold a hammer correctly. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch swing that Jed had hung, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold, Silas turned to her, his expression serious. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's not right, you calling me Grandpa. I'm not your grandfather." Elara's heart, which had been soaring with the contentment of the evening, plummeted. She had grown to love this man, this gruff, sad man who had saved her from a life of misery. She had come to think of him as her grandfather, her family. The word had felt right from the moment she'd said it. "But I want you to be," she said, her voice trembling, her eyes filling with tears. "You feel like my grandpa." Silas looked at her, at the genuine distress on her small face, and his own heart, the one he thought had turned to stone, ached. His eyes were filled with a mixture of surprise and a dawning, reluctant affection that was becoming harder and harder to deny. He reached out and placed a hand on her head, his touch now familiar and comforting. "I know, little one," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "And I think I'd like that too. Very much." A wide, radiant smile spread across Elara's face, chasing away the tears. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his familiar-smelling shirt, her heart soaring with a joy she had never known. "I love you, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. Silas's arms, hesitant at first, came around her, holding her close in a hug that was both powerful and tender. "I love you too, little one," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer deny. "I love you too." And so, the feared rancher and the orphan girl found a family in each other, their broken hearts mended by the slow, steady, and powerful healing of love. They were two lost souls who had found their way home, their lives becoming intertwined like the deep, strong roots of the old oak tree on the hill, strong, resilient, and forever bound together. The seasons changed, and the years passed as peacefully as the river that flowed through the valley. Elara grew from a small, timid girl into a strong, confident young woman. She was as much a part of the ranch as the mountains and the trees, her laughter a constant, joyful melody that filled the air, and chased away the last of the shadows from the corners of the cabin. She learned to ride like the wind, her silver hair flying behind her like a banner as she raced the horses across the meadows. She learned to track animals, to read the signs of the weather in the clouds, to live in harmony with the wilderness that had become her sanctuary. She was a child of the mountains, her spirit as wild and untamed as the land she loved. Silas, too, was transformed. The icy coldness in his eyes was replaced by a warm, gentle light. The formidable wall around his heart had crumbled, brick by brick, replaced by a love for his granddaughter that was as vast and as deep as the endless sky above their ranch. He was no longer the feared, reclusive rancher of Havenwood legend. He was Grandpa Silas, a man who was loved and respected by all who knew him. He and Elara would ride into town for supplies, and the townsfolk who had once feared him now greeted him with warm smiles and friendly waves. One day a letter arrived from the town. It was from the new owner of the orphanage, a kind, compassionate woman named Mrs. Peterson, who had replaced the cruel Mrs. Gable. She had heard the story of Elara and Silas, of the miraculous transformation that had taken place in both their lives. She was writing to ask for their help. The orphanage was overcrowded, its resources stretched to the breaking point. She was looking for good families to take in the children, to give them a chance at a better life, a chance at the kind of happiness Elara had found. Elara and Silas read the letter together on the porch swing. They looked at each other, their hearts filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. They knew what they had to do. They rode into town the next day, their hearts filled with a sense of purpose. They went to the orphanage, a place that had once been a source of so much pain and fear for Elara, but now it was a place of hope. The children who had once been so listless and withdrawn were now filled with a new, vibrant energy. They were clean, well-fed, and cared for by a woman who truly loved them. Elara and Silas spent the day with the children, playing games, telling stories, and sharing their love. Elara saw the same loneliness in their eyes that had once been in her own. She saw the same desperate yearning for a family, for a place to belong. By the end of the day, they had made their decision. They would take in as many children as they could, give them a home, a family, a future filled with love and laughter. They returned to the ranch with a wagon full of children, their laughter and chatter a joyous symphony that filled the valley. The ranch, which had once been a place of solitude and grief, was now a place of life, of love, of family. And so the story of the feared rancher and the orphan girl became a legend, a story that was passed down from generation to generation in Havenwood and beyond. It was a story about the incredible power of love to heal, to transform, to create a family where there was none. It was a story about a man who had lost everything and a girl who had nothing, and how they found everything they ever needed in each other. It was a story about a grandfather and a granddaughter, their bond a testament to the enduring, resilient, and boundless power of the human heart. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more Wild West Story and drop a comment.